Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medler Mema, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hello, I'm your host, Chris Lamont, and I'm delighted to welcome to our show Oskar Gstrein, who is an Associate Professor of Human Dignity in the Digital Age and Theme Coordinator for Data Autonomy at the Anita Tammes School at the University of Groningen. Oskar recently published a thought-provoking piece on data sovereignty where he introduces the concept of data autonomy. This topic has gained renewed attention following the U.S.'s decision to sanction officials at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, a development that raised serious questions about the court's reliance on U.S.-based tech providers like Microsoft. In our increasingly fragmented world with intense tech competition between China and the United States, sovereignty is not just a territorial concept, but it's also part of our digital landscape. Oskar is here with us today to help make sense of debates surrounding data governance, sovereignty, and autonomy. Indeed, it is against this backdrop that Oskar has proposed a new and novel concept, that of data autonomy, which perhaps better captures both dilemmas associated with digital governance, but also offers policymakers insights that can enable them to better grapple with challenges to the governance of an increasingly fraught digital space. Oskar, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Thanks for the invitation, and looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. To get started, what are the various ways digital sovereignty has been defined, and are there practical ways for states to achieve this in today's world?
That is a very good question, and it's also a very complex question. So I think what is important here, without trying to go too much into history, but there is this idea when the internet became mainstream or sort of a mainstream phenomenon in the 1990s, that there is this one global network that is based on the telecommunication networks at the time, sea cables and so forth. And it was driven very much by individualistic, libertarian ideas connecting to people across the world, etc. But then, as we know, go forward to the turn of the millennium and with the dot-com boom, there was a lot of belief in what was going on in the internet. There were no solid business models. They emerged then through the 2000s, rise of big data, social media, or these kinds of things, everything moving online to the cloud. And with that, of course, the internet also became much more important from a strategic perspective, especially also as governments themselves started to digitalize and datafy more and more. And that then increasingly raised the questions throughout the 2010s, how traditional governmental structures, which rely, there's people which belong to a country, they live on a territory, there are borders for this territory. And then the sovereignty comes in with how do I order as a government what's happening outside the borders, and how do I order what's happening with the government inside the borders. And that also has, of course, the dimension that there are those huge companies in the European context, especially the American companies are very important. So you have Google, Amazon, Microsoft, who also work a lot with the government, are, of course, basically American companies from how they were brought up, but they have this global dimension. So how do the kind of values, the kind of rules that they enforce, how does it play out when it touches the sovereignty of other states which are outside of the US? And that's at the core of the question. And of course, now with the Trump administration, where there is a very strong emphasis on power and on American influence, this is a very, very urgent issue. Also because, of course, now we live much more in the cloud, for instance, of Microsoft or these other companies than in the past. Actually, the question has been brewing over several years. I just want to highlight one thing. Finally, so in 2015, at the time I was working with the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Privacy, there was a very famous case which sort of never was really decided by the US Supreme Court. And in that case, which was relating to Microsoft and the United States government, the question was whether Microsoft needed to follow an order, a judicial order, to fulfill a warrant of the US government to turn over data which was stored in Ireland, in a cloud service center in Ireland, to the United States government. A case which was never really decided. but where eventually this act was passed by the Congress, the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act or Cloud Act, which is now also at the core of the debate when there is a talk about if Microsoft will actually have to comply with national security concerns or legal orders from the US against the will of the states where the data is actually physically located in.
Right. And that gets us to the next question, and that's looking at the Gaia X project that you have mentioned, which is a European cloud platform that was hailed as a step towards achieving some form of digital sovereignty. How do you see policymakers who seek digital sovereignty achieving a degree of sovereignty in this complex world that you've described, where you have large tech providers that cross border, that are based in one country, but data is stored in another? Do you see projects like Gaia X as being a way forward to achieve data sovereignty?
Well, the short answer to that is unfortunately no at this point. I think, and that's also why I prefer to talk about data autonomy versus digital sovereignty, I think there are generally two ways to set this up. So one is power and influence driven, and this is the model which is predominantly working today. So we have those private companies which have a lot of resources, which are driving the cloud infrastructure, the rolling out of the cloud infrastructure, because it's a very high margin business for them, increasing the amount of centers which are available all around the world, or at least in the western part of the world for the US American companies, but they also try to get more influential in countries like Indonesia, for instance. And that is something which, in this question comes up, how do we deal with conflicting values in case they exist? They like to take a stance where they say, usually they are just the processor of the information and they do not really control what is going on. Now that gets very complicated when really push comes to shove, when there is national security concerns, when there is the question, how can we, for instance, when it comes to certain criminal offenses, how can we deal with that? And then you always see that there is this tension which arises where eventually the country gets these companies which are themselves very independent and try to do what is best for themselves, where we see those conflicts arising. The other model, and that's where this Gaia X idea comes from, that's what we could call a value-driven proposition, where you have a coalition of partners who work on standards for the cloud and who then try to come up with those standards and have sort of like a shared space, which is also based on a underpinning understanding of values and legal/ethical framework. But then you get interesting questions, right? So for instance, with this Gaia X coalition at the beginning, it was very much focused on a couple of European companies and that they are compatible in what they're doing from a technical and from a standardization perspective. And then there was talk about which sectors do we need therefore. And then typically these are like sectors like defense or healthcare or like these very basic state core functions. But what do you do if then a company like Microsoft or Google says, yeah, but we want to join as well, right? So are you then going into a direction where you're saying, okay, that's fine, as long as you are sticking to the same kind of values? I mean, they're very influential and have like lots of good technology and resources. Or do you say, no, this is purely, you have the wrong passport.
Right.
And we don't have really good answers to these questions. And that's why we are in the situation where we're in.
That's interesting. So you would see, for example, Denmark's recent decision to move away from Microsoft. I think also some kind of German regions have made this similar choice to be more of a reflection of this old way of thinking of data sovereignty, where you're kind of moving away from companies based on the flag, right, as opposed to a common kind of values framework.
Yeah, well, there is the interstate dimension, which I think we discussed now a lot in relation to European countries and the United States. But of course, also there is private-public relationship, right? And the matter of fact is that there are, when it really comes to cloud infrastructure, there are less than a handful of companies we are talking about. We're mostly talking about Microsoft. We are talking also a lot about Amazon and Amazon Web Services. Why? Because their cloud is often the basis for services of other companies, which run essentially their services in their cloud and use it as the basis. And then to a certain extent, we're talking about Google, but
right.
Besides that, there is a handful of other alternatives, such as, for instance, Nextcloud, but they are much smaller. It's an open source driven company which is based in Berlin, and where now everybody has high hopes that they can provide the alternative. But all they do is essentially develop an open source software, which countries like now Denmark, with this Ministry of Digitalization, or in Germany, the region of Schleswig-Holstein, where they are moving towards. But that then also means they have the software and they get support for the software, but the server infrastructure, the configuration of the systems, everything they need to do themselves. And then there is the question, where do you get the critical mass to develop those new infrastructures, right? So do you do that as an institution yourself? Do you do that as part of a country? Do you do that as a ministry in a country? And that's exactly the question also we have, or the discussions we have in the Netherlands at the moment. And that's really difficult because this is what these companies are doing really, really well. But if you're staying with the status quo, there is a sort of like dependency which is increasing on two levels. The first is there is only this less than a handful of providers which, as everything has been moving to the cloud, have access to, potentially at least, they have access to a lot of information. So the government cannot really function without the Microsoft cloud running or any of these other two clouds. And at the same time, these are typically, all of the three are U.S. American companies. So if they are being put under pressure, which might be happening against their will by the United States government, then this is really a very uncomfortable and almost scary situation to be in for a lot of European countries.
Right. We've been seeing that kind of take place at the ICC in response to the Trump administration's sanctioning of individuals in that court, and kind of this kind of pushback from Microsoft and this attempt to reassure, kind of European customers that, hey, that Microsoft is not the U.S. administration, right? And that Microsoft is not going to go comply necessarily as straightforwardly as has been initially reported in the context of the ICC. This brings us to another question, and that's kind of, you also allude to the EU Chips Act, right, as a response to growing concerns that Europe could fall further behind in kind of this global AI race, where primarily the actors are the United States and China. And do you see this as a more of a kind of an attempt to create kind of a European stack or to duplicate capacities that already exist, or something that's going to aid Europe in nudging it towards data autonomy, as you define, as opposed to data sovereignty?
Yeah, there are two things which I think need to happen. On the one hand, there needs to be more capacity closer to those states if they want to remain the degree of influence that they desire. That means also that when it comes to creating things like chips, but there's also now a lot of talks about AI factories or AI gigafactories. So these are very big centers where the training of those basic models take place and where research on AI systems, frontier AI systems, is being done. So that is certainly something that needs to happen, just to keep a basic degree of capabilities. It's about the fundamental knowledge. It's about the skills. It's about being able to have a platform for companies and services if they want to develop, to have a platform for critical services, especially in the security sector, but also in other like core government sectors, to develop in that type of area, in the area of AI and the area of emerging technologies in the digital sense. On the other hand, sovereignty is always going to be difficult for the European Union, because the European Union is per definition built up as an organization, international organization, where national states, which are sovereign, have to a certain degree transferred that sovereignty to that international organization, which means it is not sovereign itself. It's not a state, right? It's not the United States of Europe, it's the European Union. And this might be a very benign thing to say, but it's just a reminder that this sovereignty concept and this notion does not work per se. So the first question in the European Union will always be, how do you handle the different sovereign member states and their interactions? So how do you handle the different positions of France and Germany, or of Italy and the Netherlands, and so on? And the answer to that is there is a value-based approach to this. So typically, these are the three pillars: are human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And then we have like lots of legal acts around that and regulation. So we know how that works. But of course, this is now requiring to a degree an investment in infrastructure and in resources and a deeper integration in this sector than ever before. And that's the challenge.
Can you say more about some of these differences, right? You talk about it in some of your work, the French perspective on what data sovereignty means versus the German perspective on data sovereignty.
Yeah, typically the literature would then go to Germany as an export-focused country. So it wants to be more open and have good relations with countries like both China and the United States, because they're both very important for the German industry, especially, which has also its own problems right now. So in that sense, it's much more open. In France, you have a very strong focus on sovereignty in the classical sense. France being the only nuclear power within the European Union, trying also when it comes to these companies, at least from a consumer perspective, the biggest sort of like company that we have in terms of AI in Europe when it comes to those large language models, etc. That's this Mistral company, right, which has its own kind of chatbots and models, some of them open source, some of them commercial. So also here you see an attempt to really on French soil with sort of like a French accent or in the French language. It's also a very important aspect when we talk about digital sovereignty, right? So that there is also this cultural aspect when you think about a country such as China, where lots of people, own culture, own language, then of course it's much more deeply integrated from the outset than many other European countries. And then if you move on from the two big ones, from Germany and France to countries like the Netherlands, well, the Netherlands historically, or even also Denmark, they have a very strong transatlantic component to them in terms of information exchange when it comes to security, national security, when it comes to things like, so where do the fighter jets come from? There is traditionally a reliance on the United States. And until a couple of years, maybe for some people even months ago, nobody would have ever questioned that there is a problem with that, right? That just works very well, that is efficient, it's safe. We have now also these days the NATO summit in The Hague coming up. And you really see that people are now thinking, what do we do in a world where this sort of, eternal truth that especially Western Europe can rely on the United States, right? That's just no longer the case. And this is one of the areas where it becomes most visible just because the dependency on those handful of companies is so big.
Right. And this gets us back to your approach. On the one hand, you've defined data sovereignty as being more focused on kind of power and international relations and classic kind of statecraft, whereas data autonomy is more of a values-based concept that can be derived from the existing European legal framework and values. What would you identify now in the 2025 and going forward as some of the biggest practical obstacles to achieving some form of data autonomy for the European Union?
Yeah, the biggest problem is at which layer can you scale? So when you're talking about open standards, when you're talking about interoperability, well, there's of course many technical questions to it, but it is possible to go into that direction. However, a lot of work still needs to be done for these types of services and platforms, such as, for instance, xCloud, to gain functionality, etc. And even xCloud is more like it's an umbrella where then a lot of other typical software projects are being integrated and so on. So it's, as I mentioned, it's very open standards. But then the question is, so who exactly is building up that server infrastructure? Is there a country which is paying for that? Is it the European Union which is paying for that? How do you get with that into a business-to-business public infrastructure type of business environment where things start running and scaling? How do you get with that even to a consumer environment where American companies are doing an amazing job to keep those relationships and to grow them? And at the same time, so that's the main challenge, right? So at which layer of this whole discussion do you want to scale? I think governments themselves are in many ways obvious choices. We also are doing a lot of work in the university sector, and there's a lot of discussion about it in the Netherlands as well. But of course, transitions like this are very challenging and not easy to do on many different layers. And at the same time, what we are seeing, and this is to be expected, is that companies like especially Microsoft, they are thinking of ways to have something like a Microsoft Europe where they are, a European cloud, so to speak, which is still like from Microsoft, but he had this model in the past already. There was a pilot run a couple of years ago together with Deutsche Telekom, so a big German telecommunications company, where the idea was, to put it very simply, that the cloud center would be run with technology and server of Microsoft, but they don't have the key. We'll put very simply. So if somebody wants to go inside and change something or get access to data or physically do something, then you would have to go through the Deutsche Telekom. That was at the time, I think, also really focusing on health and the legal services, etc. But at some point it stopped because it's just a more expensive version of the same type of cloud, and people at the time were not willing to pay that premium. Now, the question is, of course, if they come with a new version of that, with some type of fiduciary setup, will there be more demand? Will they offer it at a lower price? So from what they say themselves, in the case of Microsoft, again, the European business in the cloud, it's around 20 to 25%, something of that. So that's the ballpark figure we're talking about. And I think it is also fair to say that a company like that they are themselves probably not happy, but what the demands of the administration are very often to them. Right. But I still think if you're looking at it from a resilience perspective, from a strategic autonomy perspective, then there is no real choice but to also work on developing alternatives and to foster that.
And how optimistic would you be that the EU would get to that place in the next few years?
I think it's going to be very difficult, but it is possible. And I think, as I mentioned, there is no real alternative not to do that. The only alternative not to do that is to increase dependencies which already exist. And so it's not, the longer you think about it, and there is no real alternative scenario to that. Now, what's going to happen in practice, we will see. It depends on the investment of policymakers. It depends on also changing people's mindset, where I think a lot of things are happening at the moment. But
And can you say something about how your values-based framework or data autonomy can better handle potentially conflicts between individual data autonomy and public policy? So, for example, if you might think about public health or security.
I mean, we have, of course, in Europe, there is a lot of tradition around data protection and how that works. So that actually data autonomy is coming from two different angles. So, right, there is this strategic autonomy discussion, which we had now mostly. But the other part of it is indeed this relationship between individual data, personal data, and how to deal with that. And what we see, if we take health as an example, so there is a lot of discussion about European health data spaces, for instance, then we see that on the one hand, there is a very big desire to have it very well protected, which things like data protection do very well. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of desire to reuse that kind of data. And the idea is also to leverage the kind of concept to base it on something which is slightly different than data protection. So to put human dignity at the core as a concept which does that, which is called informational self-determination. But that is very abstract and very high level. And I think the difference to informational self-determination when it was founded in the 1980s to nowadays is that there is much more, and it's also like very high level if I say that, but today we have much more methodologies and knowledge in working in interdisciplinary settings, which allow us to design systems in a different way, to think about impact assessment methodologies, to there's a lot of work also going on in the I space at this moment to have certain inspection models, frameworks, etc. And I think if we are working more in this direction and putting human dignity at the core as a value, but then looking at it not only from an individualist, but also from a more collectivist type of perspective. So that's the type of direction where I think there could be a lot of potential in re-understanding without giving up all of the nice things and principles that come with data protection, but to re-understanding and reshaping how we can use and leverage data.
Interesting. And I guess to wrap up, just one final question, and that's what developments in digital sovereignty or data autonomy should we be looking out for in the coming months or year?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how the US big tech companies, such as Microsoft, but not only, of course, how they are now going to respond to this, because they already started. So there is Brad Smith, for instance, from Microsoft, who put out blog posts, had several, gives interviews here in the Netherlands, or goes to Brussels and talks about guarantees that they give. And it's just going to be very interesting, because I'm sure it's going to be a very sophisticated approach, how they are trying to navigate this intersection between there is this parade now coming up in the US where, for instance, a lot of big tech companies are also like sponsoring the parade, but they don't want to be, seems like, officially attached to it.
Right.
So it will be like a real interesting situation to see how they are themselves going to navigate that space. And if they can find a way to win the trust of policymakers in European countries, then of course all the developments around going to alternatives and adapting them, because they are there. So it's just a question of adoption. Then that of course will go in slower. But having said that, I think there is so much fundamental insecurity in the world at the moment that, yeah.
And with that, kind of that image of tech companies trying to balance, on the one hand, maintaining kind of a seat at the table of influence within this current U.S. administration, while also trying to reassure those global clients that these companies won't kind of bend to the will of the administration when it comes to pressure and its own preferences and its own ideas about data sovereignty from a U.S. perspective. Oskar, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have to certainly revisit this conversation sometime in the coming months or years. But for now, that's it for today's show. Join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.